Hola, buenas tardes todos y todas, y vamos comenzando ya este acto de presentación del
Good
informe.
afternoon, all of our dear guests. We're going to begin this afternoon session on the triple nexus in practical terms, challenges and proposals for Spanish cooperation. We have launched this, the Institute IECAH, with the support of AECID, and very especially thanks also to humanitarian aid within AECID. I'm Francesco Rey. I'm with IECAH. I'm one of the co-authors, and two brief housekeeping points. We are recording this session for all of you to be aware of the fact, and we have interpretation into English and into Spanish. You may so select the language by selecting the tab. I will be moderating this afternoon. I will, of course, also briefly introduce the session. Let me begin, of course, by saying thank you very much to AECID for their support to IECAH, and especially Christian Freres, who is with us this afternoon, who will be addressing us and who will be talking a little bit about the study and the role of Nexus in Spanish cooperation. Thank you also to my colleagues within IECAH. And thank you to Beatriz Abellán as co-author, and of course our two international speakers, Francesco, Michele, and Ralf Südhoff. Thank you for being with us, and I will introduce you briefly afterwards. Next slide, please. So, very, very straightforwardly, this is what we're going to be addressing this afternoon. A very brief introduction. I will break down the different parts that make up the whole of the study, and then we will have some time for Francesco, Ralf, and Christian, and after that, a conversation or a debate with the persons who are with us this afternoon. Next slide, please. Thank you. For those of you who don't really know the specifics about IECAH, this is our pitch, as we say. The IECAH, an Institute of Studies on Conflict and Humanitarian Action, focuses on these areas that you see on screen right now. And today we are going to be focusing on investigation and research activities performed by IECAH. Apart from that, of course, I would like to share with you that there is also formación, which is skilling, on the Humanitarian platform addressing the issue of Nexus. You can query that. I wanted to ensure that we understand that IECAH carries out research on different issues which have to do with humanitarian action and peace fostering activities. Those are our main lines of action, and other areas of cooperation as well. Now, we know that humanitarian activities and cooperation stem from a very long time ago, and for decades now, a number of initiatives have been brought forward to increase the efficiency of international cooperation. There are different proposals, there are different ways of broaching development, and we've seen in recent years that these have been the basic activities. And furthermore, peace issues have also been important. But I did want to say that when we talk about Nexus, this is something that we have been focusing on for some time already. Initially, I have to say there was a certain degree of skepticism, if you will. We tiptoed around the issue because those of us who come from the humanitarian field of work believe that a nexus could actually represent some potential threats affecting humanitarian principles, of course. But thanks to research activities, the implementation of Nexus in the Venezuelan crisis, for instance, or other contexts, well, we have understood that this is an important and valuable concept for a number of reasons. First, that Nexus if you think about Spanish cooperation, which really focuses on the objectives that we are familiar with, well, we must focus on peace on number 16. And it seemed to us that the Nexus approach, the Nexus focus could very well be a way of positioning ourselves within cooperation and positioning those issues that have to do with peace building activities. And then there's a second line of action when we think about peace building and turning it into part and parcel of Spanish cooperation. Now, we have not been 100% successful yet, but we're working on that. So these are the reasons why at IECAH, together with the Spanish Association of International Development, have understood that it was relevant to underscore the importance of the Nexus and try to be very practical in our orientation so as to implement a number of ideas that are germane to our activities. Next slide, please. So, in a very straightforward way, what we have tried to do with this study is understand what the cooperation community in Spain in general is focusing on, the issues at hand. So we have examined more specifically, and with regards to funding tools that are available to Spanish cooperation, we wanted to see what the challenges are, the hurdles that may make the optimization and launching of the Nexus approach that might represent a hurdle, as I say. And we have studied the pros and cons, as they say, of the Nexus approach as the identifying element of Spanish activities, both public and NGOs. We have a working methodology which can only be described as conventional. You can see that on the left of the screen. So we've seen the bibliography, we've surveyed a number of entities, key stakeholders and a number of semi-structured interviews. This is what we wanted to share with all of you now. And this is what we will be discussing. So I'm going to give the floor now to Beatriz, who will talk about the basic structure. So thank you, and you have the floor. Thank you very much, Paco, and thank you very much to all of the participants who are with us this afternoon. We're going to very briefly present the study, which will be available on our website. You can download it, and we have included a translation of the summary in English for those of you who are following us in English. This study, as Paco points out, has as an objective the examination of the acceptance of the triple nexus. And we have interviewed persons from AECID, persons who are active in cooperation activities, NGOs in Spain. So this is why we believe that the recommendations that we will be broaching are designed for cooperation, designed to improve and advance our activities. Before I do anything else, let me give you a little bit of background information about the Nexus approach. For those of you who aren't familiar with the approach, as Paco said, the network makes a reference to the importance of linking humanitarian activities, development activities, and peace building activities. You can imagine that the specificities are different, and the objective is to strengthen the three C's. They have to be complementary, they have to be cohesive, they have to ensure collaboration. That's the triple C. But there are multi-causal elements and root causes also, which are increasingly difficult to tackle. And this is why we're keeping our eye on the long term. We take into account the vulnerabilities and we take these root causes into account right from the very beginning. We will see that peace is the component which is perhaps the one that creates more ambiguity and confusion and lack of understanding. And that is why we believe we will have to focus on this in order to understand what this aggregate actually represents. We've seen that there is a link between development and the different activities and humanitarian aid for many years now. So peace, I repeat, is the hurdle in order to really understand what we mean when we say peace and peace building, and what can be understood when we say peace and peace building. So in our report, as you said, we refer to the CAD OECD recommendations. This is our guidebook, if you will, for the triple nexus. There is no one single definition, but this document, which was put together in 2019, is deemed to be the block, if you will, the cornerstone of triple nexus. This document includes important concepts that explain triple nexus and what this actually implies. So there is a very important approach, which is seeking those objectives and comparing. As you can see on slide, when we talk about collective results, there are three different areas, and what we need to do is keep in mind the collective results right from the beginning. We cannot wait until the future. No, once we have decided, once we begin to plan, we need to keep in mind the collective results. And then that joint approach or joint up approach, it's difficult to interpret, as Francesco will explain, but this involves coordination, programming, and financing or funding from a complementary point of view. This is a risk-based analysis, and of course, gender issues have to be taken into account as well. And finally, comparative advantage or the edge. Each author, each component will have capacities and skills which they've specialized in, and those need to be leveraged in order to ensure that this link, this relationship, this objective to improve coordination and consistency actually be achieved. Now, in order for this to happen, we need to explain what the triple nexus is not. This is relatively novel. We are working on the definition, and as we will see in our studies, there seems to be confusion regarding the implications. So it is not only an activity that involves humanitarian stakeholders. We saw this at the beginning of our activities. We were interviewing persons from different organizations, and they always focused on humanitarian activities. No, everyone is involved: humanitarian, development, and peace building. Then also understand that triple nexus does not imply combining different activities abiding by a linear logic. So first do this, then do that, and then the final. So no, it actually implies breaking down with this linear approach and looking for a continuum, ensuring that collective results are envisaged right from the beginning. And then the need to find and build new tools that really are useful for the triple nexus approach: planning, funding. So tools that we have access to in different countries, in Germany, in Italy. This is not what you might necessarily expect. Another issue, of course, is establishing uh, coordination. In other words, setting up meetings. This is happening already, but triple nexus does not envisage only exceptional meetings. So this is something that must be included right from the beginning. And finally, this, of course, segues into the first point, is not just this VARD approach, but and then throwing in a little bit of peacekeeping. No, we need to think about peacekeeping right from the beginning. It actually implies a sea change for cooperation activities. So very briefly, because this report is under the umbrella of Spanish cooperation, let me explain what we've done so far to date. As Francisco said, Spanish cooperation have been very keen We have seen a translation. I said that the CAD was very important, that triple nexus. A number of sessions have been scheduled. We have also begun to include in some of our strategies, such as Latin American and the Caribbean 2022-2023. And also, as we'll see, there have been on-site activities too. And furthermore, Spain is involved and is a part of the UCAD network of the OECDs and has also participated in Nexus Academy, which is a new initiative, an academy which I think you should visit, check its website. The point is to encourage this triple approach to Nexus. Different stakeholders will be able to participate and understand what triple Nexus means and how we can actually ensure its implementation. Now, our findings then. I don't want to take up much more of your time, but I must make a reference to the findings. As you can see in the report, we see the structure in Spain in terms of legislation, in terms of strategies, and of course the Nexus approach. But let's talk, as I said, about the findings. What is more important is the acceptance by the stakeholders in Spanish cooperation. I have to say that it was not a surprise, but definitely it was wonderful. It was great to see how very welcome Nexus is among Spanish cooperation stakeholders. And in general, when we ask them, they do say that what seems to be most important is the long-term approach. Many NGOs underscore the need to have programs that truly do allow for continuity and also to be more consistent and to be more coordinated. So it was deemed in general terms, thinking about different factors, national and decentralized cooperation, it was agreed that it is, in fact, an opportunity for the long term. The desire to contribute to triple nexus does exist. And then, well, we asked what triple nexus is, and perhaps there we have a little bit of work to do. People are familiar with the concept, triple nexus, it rings a bell, but often enough, there's no clear understanding of what this meaning is. So we need to think long and hard about what it means to work Nexus style. And then also, we asked how they became familiar, and 70% said that they had talked about it in their organizations. Some had taken the time to do research on their own, and many had broached the issue in house. But I can say that there are few NGOs that really include the concept of triple nexus. They don't mainstream it, with the exception perhaps of Oxfam. They do have some information about multi-mandate, and in general, there is a certain degree of openness. There is a desire to participate in this approach. Now, when we asked about whether there are programs running that link activities involving humanitarian action, development, and peace building, well, this could be a leading question because there are very many persons answering that they did, in fact, know or were carrying out the approach. So we could jump up and say, oh, Nexus is happening. Well, no, not really. We've understood that this is just a VARD issue, it's a VARD approach, maybe a smattering of peace, and already that is deemed to be a Nexus approach when it is not the case. And then often enough, this idea and of not really going into the structural causes right from the beginning. So as we've mentioned before, the recommendation establishing the principles very clearly, and often enough, well, this recommendation isn't really understood. It hasn't been read. So that doesn't allow for the definition of triple nexus to be the appropriate one. I would like also to talk about triple nexus being the term used. Humanitarian action, development, and peace building. We're working nexus wise, but it's important to make a specific reference of to this issue. Now, also the peace component is very important, and we know that it is the one that is most challenging. What does this peace actually mean? What does it mean when we think about this triple pronged approach? With regards to Spain and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there is a strategy which dates back to 2008, but it has barely been availed of. It is, however, we believe, an opportunity that will allow us to work along the lines of peace building in the field of Spanish cooperation. Many of the persons whom we've surveyed work in development and humanitarians, so peace continues to be a minority issue, but the peace component calls for knowing and having expertise on the conflict, action without causing any harm, so do no harm. And many persons said that yes, they had used tools to minimize negative impacts. This is, of course, wonderful, but sometimes a question, if you ask, what do these tools mean? What does working with these tools actually imply? Well, you need to understand what the risks are right from the beginning. This is an engine of violence, and this needs to be included in the plan at the planning stages. These are reports that we've mentioned recently, and often enough, this does not happen systematically. The use of tools does not happen systematically, and often enough, you need to have a certain degree of expertise. And finally, now, a very important finding is to understand the challenges. We need to be able to identify the challenges because this will allow the stakeholders to play that very important role. So, as we've seen here, we see that current funding mechanisms, for the most part, the response was that it was important or very important. It is, in fact, an element that makes it possible or not to be triple nexus. We'll see some specific responses now. Some of the stakeholders who explained that these programs, subject to yearly funding, rigid programming, they explained that it was actually difficult to carry out the activities. And then secondly, the absence of space for coordination activities. So in Spain, we have the territorials, and often enough that you do uh, in fact organize sessions and coordinate activities, but those that have headquarters in Madrid are fine, but those that do not have headquarters in Madrid seem to have more difficulties. Other elements that are not very relevant is the absence of armed conflict. People think that that is not important, and the risk of contaminating humanitarian aid. As Paco said, the risk of contamination, there was initially some reticence among the humanitarian stakeholders, but now tools are used that allow for this to perhaps. It does not have to adversely affect humanitarian aid. There are some sentences, some quotes that I would like to share with you. We talked about the lack of tools for multi-sectoral pluriannual funding. It's more difficult to meet up at a national level because headquarters are at a distance, and often because mechanisms are very stiff and it's difficult to liaise. So we understand clearly how things stand, and we see that yes, there are points in common, and we see an ongoing repetition of funding tools, coordination of activities, and rigid mechanisms. And then finally, localization. This pops up now, but it is a key element when we think about those recommendations. As you know, the idea of triple nexus actually comes to the surface after the BARD. There was an agreement to ensure greater efficiency and more inclusiveness in humanitarian aid. So, this is the idea. Stakeholders and local agencies should be the ones designing the response, having that principal role in planning and programming so that they be taken into account. We asked about this. We asked whether there was inclusion of local communities in the planning of projects. 92% answered yes. And then the idea is that things are a little bit blurrier when you think about development, humanitarian aid, and peacekeeping. So this triple nexus approach is going to hone in on the reality of the different situations. And also, this implies a brutal analysis of the context in order to understand what the situation is, not only in macro terms, but in micro terms as well. And the final point, which is also important, is gender issues. Is this being included or not? Was the question, and 100% said yes. So, point number 3 of the recommendation underscores the importance of equality in order to forestall conflicts, the role of women in the entire process, but there are a couple of documents that we make a reference to in our report. One is recent from the IASC. It's one that focuses on gender approaches. So, yes, it's acknowledged, but strategic frameworks are necessary in order to truly ascertain that gender related issues are included in the Nexus approach. And then other issues, including the different approaches. So it wouldn't only be talking about gender period as a principle, but it calls for being a little bit more specific. And now, advancing towards the final portion of the recommendations, we believe it's important to continue the work being carried out by Spanish cooperation with the CAD. Christian will talk in detail about Spain's contribution within the network and the kind of support, the keen desire to work in Nexus. And we will further explore knowledge of experiences in other countries. We will be hearing from Italy and from Germany. And then practical cases, the debate about the triple nexus. The third point is very important. Reach out, ensure that the debate becomes familiar to all among the different stakeholders. We need to understand what this actually implies. Develop the peace component within triple nexus. There is a study on the migratory crisis of Venezuela and the Nexus approach because we reached very interesting conclusions, understanding peace not only as an absence of direct conflict, but also understanding that the culture of peace in a free society is absolutely essential. It's important that peace be defined according to these lines and not along other more limited lines. And so it's very important to reach consensus among all of the parties involved and stakeholder. Also, as I said before, it's important to rebroach the planning tools and the funding tools. This is not something that's in vogue now. No, this calls for real changes. And we are aware of the fact that these changes are difficult to achieve, but we all understand that it's important. We all understand that it is essential to accept the change in order to be able to tackle these new theses. And then also localization, ensuring that local organizations really be involved and that they really do participate. We saw in our findings that the best way of achieving this is by working with local authorities, with local women's associations, local NGOs. That will allow us to ensure that, in fact, the actions that are being carried out truly adapt to each specific context. And finally, ensure that financial and human resources are available. This approach calls for change, and change calls for work. So, who is there? And where are we doing our jerk? So, you would have to think about the funding and Nexus Academy. We need to ensure that the tools be as flexible as possible. And we need to remember that we need time and the commitment and resources. So these are the recommendations. This is a preliminary study with some findings that are perhaps very relevant and might be useful, and take those decisions. Triple Nexus now is landing, if you will. This is a new approach, relatively speaking, but the time is now to finalize and to implement. There have been debates raging, and what we want to do now is make sure that we are practical in our approach. We will afterwards have time for questions and for clarifications, but I hope that this session has been useful. I hope that I have correctly explained it very briefly, the contents of this publication. Thank you very much, Bea. We wanted to take advantage of being together to address this issue. The report is on our website, but we want to first give the floor to Francesco, Michele, who is with the Italian Association. We worked with him on the Venezuelan case, and I think it's fair to say that we learned from each other. Our ideas bounced off each other. He's been working with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with Italian cooperation entities to talk about Italian cooperation. And we've asked him to share with us some of his thoughts because he is an expert in the field. Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, Francisco. Can you hear me? Yes, very good. Thank you. So, yes, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I have to say that it's important to share. The more we share, the better. Definitely. It's important to share our knowledge and to share our doubts. Francisco said, we want to talk about those recommendations that stem from the process that we've carried out in Italy. In Italy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and already there's an element in common, right? The Oficina de Emergencia, the emergency office or agency, has opened a working group at the end of 2018 to build the guidelines regarding the nexus of the entire Italian cooperation system. This working group has met on a monthly basis every 4 to 6 weeks for 3 years now. And the agency is involved, the ministry is involved, a representative of NGOs, and a representative of the university, the academic world. That's very interesting. Now, before I share anything, let me just explain in three brushstrokes what we do in Italy. First, it's been defined at the beginning as a process that focalizes on strategic guidelines, not operational. So, step number one is that we've seen that we're trying to build that joint understanding of all of the stakeholders, nexus wise and other aspects wise. And then something else, and I'm going to repeat this, we've seen a definition of two concepts. One is the approach of the system itself. So the Nexus approach, so that which has to appear in all of the programming, and then the operational exercises that we run through. So how we actually run Nexus in different countries. And in the drafting of the guidelines, we have based on the dark recommendations, and it's very, very basic, those three elements that we know. The challenges, well, the first one is a generalized fear of all of us who participated in the process: NGOs, the agencies from the different ministries, the Italian Cooperation Agency, a fear of what is actually implicit in operationalizing the Nexus and ensuring that it is operational, having it be up and running. It's important to remember that we have had to focus more on de-ambiguating terms, so clarifying the meaning of some terms. As we said before, we've afterwards, after a year and a half, we've come to understand that stakeholders were talking about two different things. Some of us were talking about the approach, and others were talking about operational exercises. So that's why there was a differentiation. What the guidelines do is they specify what the system is in Italy that implements the Nexus approach everywhere. Yes, the approach is that, but two different operational pilot exercises have been defined in order to build the operational guidelines. So that's going to be a second set of exercises. There were a number of challenges, of course, that have to do with different degrees of understanding, different degrees of establishing a relationship between and among the mechanisms. So the first was the ministry and the agency was very keen to involve the different agencies, the different DGs. But we always wondered what institutional stakeholders should actually be involved, what agencies should be involved. We believe that DG on peace building, DG on gender issues, DG development. So these are different mechanisms within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it has frankly been very complicated throughout these 3 years to know whom to involve. Even if we involved the agency or the DG, it was difficult to identify the right candidate, the right person, because it's important to establish that relationship as well. So, depending on, always talking about the challenges here, identifying that the processes, the Nexus processes, are different in terms of capital, in terms of the country. It seems self evident, but it's been actually very difficult to understand. And furthermore, it's been difficult to understand how to run it. So, joint programming and all of those different aspects, we had to define how it's done at a country level, at a capital level. That is very important from the point of view of NGOs. And from the point of view of institutions and the ministry of the agency, it is even more complicated because the mechanisms do not necessarily exist. A broader challenge was the need, when we have advanced, when we have really gotten into the terminology and so on, when we have become a little bit more concrete, the need to abide by legislation. In Italy, we have legislation which predates the Nexus debate, so the mechanisms are not necessarily in place that allow for Nexus. So, by way of an example, in the past year, we have focused on thinking how to do this, looking at legislation and seeing what was possible and what was not. We have not always been successful in achieving an ideal solution, but in general, it's fair to say that we do have a broad framework that allows us to avail ourselves of legislation. This is very important because as civil society, our reaction was to say, why do we have to abide by that legislation? But on the other hand, this conversation has led us to understanding that if we can actually enshrine this in legislation, there will be an agency that will be able to avail itself of the mechanisms. And To conclude, the challenges, of course, everything that I've just shared, the concerns, the fear, the need to do this and that, probably have limited our analysis as to how to actually carry out these activities, the different analyses, elements necessary for programming, for funding. And we have focused probably two-thirds of the work on a joint analysis. This joint analysis was where we, as stakeholders, would be able to find an agreement. And this is a fundamental element because if we rightly assess that joint analysis that will allow us to run our programming, all of that would allow different stakeholders to use our own mechanisms in the best manner possible. So it could be programming or any other kind. So within that process, having to think about the clarification of terms, the main challenge, as discussed before, was to clarify that joint up program. In English, it means one thing, but in Italian, it was very complicated to bring this through because the translation could define mechanisms that are not included in our legislation. So we reached a solution which is a halfway solution between coordination, another degree of coordination, right? So a little bit more, but at a lower level of co-programming, because co-programming has some implicit elements. Programming is in the hands of the ministry. So we cannot say that we're going to co-program with NGOs, for instance. So there, the definition, well, first we thought it's the wording, and then we talked and we understood that it had to do with the mechanisms. And this is what has brought us to understanding that a solution was in the making. There are many recommendations. I would perhaps focus on five. The first is that throughout these years, we've exchanged many experiences, and probably the most important one is to not focus on linking up a nexus with a specific element in a given country. Finding common objectives, aligning programs, that is very difficult. We've seen that what has made the processes simple, in other words, lessons learned, and having that territorial approach. So, because the Italian system is what it is, we focused on a given territory. We understood how to actually carry out the Nexus operation, and from that point onwards, escalate. That's been much more effective. We have many other examples in other parts. So that is very important. It allows us, it ensures actually that we have had to find, as they say, that halfway meeting point. Another recommendation, as a system in Italy, we see that there are two aspects that need to be taken into account. One is to have lines of action that generate a standard for all to ensure consistency with Nexus principles, but there are operational mechanisms that ensure that Nexus will be run differently depending on the country. So we understand that we cannot have the same Nexus system in every country. It is much more efficient to have the possibility of building as best as possible the Nexus system that you need. Another very important recommendation, and this uh, was the result of long debates, is that Nexus does not mean co-programming. This is very important. This is very important. And I have to say that this is a recommendation. In the Italian system, at least, Nexus has become a process in which the Nexus needs to be the best possible definition of consultation levels on the basis of a joint analysis. So that joint analysis has to be built in order to ensure that the agency and its mechanisms of whatever kind, and the ministry with its own mechanisms, and the NGO, we have different mandates. Each one of us with our own mechanisms will be able to base that analysis and then establish the setting. I say this because there's another element that we've identified. We've analyzed, of course, the existing systems. for development, for humanitarian purposes, and so on. And we have not necessarily seen that we need to rethink it. So the mechanisms that exist now, humanitarian ones, for instance, or other mechanisms, which are very good, but they are not necessarily guaranteeing the elements that allow us to achieve a nexus of it. So it's all has to be evidence-based, of course. In our conversation in Italy, we've seen that this evidence does not allow us to really find that element. We need to introduce those elements. Why? Because we're working on peace, we're working on conflict resolution or what have you, and analysis and sensitivity. And this, of course, was important in your Venezuelan research. And I have to add two things which are more operational in nature. When we talk about conflict analysis, we have seen this, and by the way, this was published in that report. The report itself, as I say, says that that approach in and of itself is not sufficient. It needs to be operational. We need to better rethink, all of us, we need to rethink how we're going to make it operational. So by way of an example, we've turned our joint analysis into roadmaps, soft and hard, as they say in English, more specific activities and more relational activities, which are going to be inserted this everywhere, because we see that we have to focus on these activities if we want to build peace. Crises are such that there's always a crisis. It could be social, it could be territorial, it could be of whatever nature, regional, country. But the underlying idea before we talked about it was that. Perhaps I'll stop now. Thank you very, very much for having invited me. I'm delighted to be here. Francesco, thank you very much. When we were researching and before, what you are doing in Italy was a benchmark. Thank you very much for underscoring this and for reminding us about how important joint diagnoses are in order to be able to build better. And those institutional aspects, and of course, legislation. I have to say that in Spain, we are currently discussing legislation on cooperation. IECAH and other entities have requested that the Nexus be specifically referred to, this idea of a broader approach. Thank you, Francesco. And we had asked our friend Ralf Südhoff from the Center for Humanitarian Action based in Berlin for his thoughts. This is a center that researches humanitarian issues. It's a think tank which has definitely made a splash with the Nexus idea and what it represents for Italian cooperation. Thank you very much, Ralf. If anybody needs interpretation from English into Spanish, please select the tab.
Many thanks for having me. You can hear me and you can see the shared screen. Is that okay? Excellent. Well, many thanks for the invitation. It's really a great honor, and I think it's really an event on the spot. We've started our research on the triple nexus in practice 2019. And a lot of what I've heard sounds familiar, and happy to share some perspectives on lessons learned from the German perspective, on the German setup, and maybe a bit beyond on international issues as we try to look into a couple of country case studies and to learn from the experience also in other settings and from other countries. Why would I say that the approach of IECAH on looking at the triple nexus in practice is very much echoing what we heard When we did a survey on our Nexus study, we asked a similar question. I'm happy to share what is holding everybody on the triple Nexus to implement it 5 years after the World Humanitarian Summit agreed that this is a key issue. And if you look at the results, I hope you can see here up top, what's the most common challenge? The very first response has been 70% said, well, it's simply the unclarity what it means in practice, as there have been so many meta debates, so much about the conceptualization, etc., but so little experience and so little analysis also on the experience on the ground. And the other perspective, looking into Spanish cooperation, also on the donor side, the Italian cooperation, as well as the German setting on the donor side, I think can also be underlined how important this perspective is, because when just sharing another question, when we asked what is the key obstacle for implementing in practice a humanitarian development peace nexus, as you can see on the second slide, the top two responses have been related to donor policies. And I think that's a good hint why it's so important to look not only into this. We've been also analyzing in depth, for example, the setup of some German actors, German NGOs, for example, and have been very critical of them that they are not really ready to move for various reasons. Organizational issues, for example, but I think it's a given and underlined here that looking into donor policies and making them workable for a nexus, actually in the very beginning, donors have been asking for. I think that's a key point. So quickly jumping into the German context, I would like to share 4 points with you. One is what is the specific challenge on the HDP and the German setup. For a quick introduction into what is the institutional setup, which is of course complex as everything in Germany, as we like and love rules and institutions, insisting on rules. What happened in the past years to deal with that, and what are still remaining issues from our point of view. I might quickly share 2 quotes with you. One is underlining what the Foreign Office in its humanitarian strategy fixed years ago, why it believes the nexus is so important. Not surprisingly, probably if you read quickly the quote, it's an important paradigm shift, needs to be coordinated, interlinked, everything exchanged as early as possible, and exchange of information is of utmost importance. At the same time, the German Finance Ministry, which runs spending reviews regularly, as probably in most countries, how funds are spent and how well coordinated this is done, for example, between ministries, came to the following conclusion. And that was really groundbreaking and really an uproar, for example, in the German parliament. Just sharing one quick quote. The colleagues, usually very bureaucratic and diplomatic for obvious reasons in their analysis, taught the other institutions, in a sense, the lessons, telling them, well, for an effective use of funds, it is necessary to conduct a joint analysis of the situation on the ground, which one might expect to be a given. Based on this, a coordinated conception and planning of measures and the allocation should be carried out. And so far, so their conclusion, there is no systematic and binding approach to the coordination process. So it was obvious that things need to change, and for this, I'm happy to share a few quick points with you on the setup in Germany, and quickly sharing why this is maybe in particular challenging in some ways if you look into the institutional setup in Germany. On the one hand, we have a foreign office which is in charge of humanitarian affairs. And at the same time, if you look into the nexus, in the HDP nexus related arena, of course, on security policies and with a strong focus on stabilization issues. Institutional wise, there is a big department actually running and in charge of the greatest share of funds of the German Foreign Office, which is at the same time in charge of stabilization policies, peace building, and humanitarian affairs. which can be, of course, good news for linking up efforts, and which can be bad news if you look into issues of humanitarian affairs having their own rules and principles and might being needed to be protected from other interests. On the other hand, you have a series of actors, but the key other actor is the development ministry, which is in charge of course, long-term development programs, some peace building programs, and a big chunk which tries to be a binding element, which is called transitional assistance, which should be the binding element between the foreign affairs, humanitarian issues, and the development long-term programs. And at the same time, the development ministry has a peace building unit, but this is not much interlinked, or has not been much interlinked even in-house. Plus, in all these ministries, you have, of course, also regional and country units who run a big deal of programs on the development side, who have a big say, of course, in the Foreign Office on everything decided, and have as some say, pretty much own life, and it's very hard to coordinate with these cross-cutting policy issues, either peace building, either gender, or in this case, a nexus. So you have a setup, and it might be similar in other countries, either in one house or split into two ministries to bring the key actors together, and that's also something which has been highlighted by the spending review I mentioned. Since then, a couple of measures have been taken to improve the situation and to link German efforts up on the government side. For one, there has been started a so-called GAP, which is a joint analysis and planning unit, which has been established between the two ministries to coordinate better what is done. For a start, in terms of analysis, basic analysis, as the spending review indicated that even that has been missing, and building on the joint analysis, hopefully joint approaches in one way or the other, or at least wherever appropriate. Sometimes, of course, not really feasible. As a second measure, in very practical programming terms, an approach has been taken to link, for example, for international actors, for INGOs or for international organizations, to allow them joint programming in a very special way. It's not possible regularly if you come as an agency to the German government to ask for humanitarian and development funding at the same time, or even to say, well, we have one program where we do and somehow both of it, so please fund it from both budget lines, which would be totally against budgetary law. So as a solution or as a first step, the ministries came up with the so-called chapeau approach, which is a tool allowing agencies to pitch, as they did for decades, on the development side, a development program in, let's say, Iraq for IDPs, for long-term development, education, but at the same time to ask for humanitarian support to this very same program in the same region by the Foreign Office. So in a way, it's a very complex setup, more or less following still the rule that both have to ask for different support from different ministries, but they somehow inform that they will combine funds they get from the different sources in two interlinked programs. This has been appreciated by a couple of agencies in a way as a first step to coordinate better, at least within the German setting, what's been done. But it needs to be said that this is so far limited to linking humanitarian and development efforts. So there is a gap. The user is not, it's still missing the peace element, as you can hear and see about it. And that's also something where the ministries themselves say, well, we still have to take the next step, and it's still a lesson to be learned. And final point on what has been decided to change, the development ministry came up with a new country priority list, which they had for many years, but for the first time they integrated into these lists a couple of priority peace-building countries to integrate development and peace efforts, hopefully in these countries, to have a more integrated approach in-house from the development side. So what are the ongoing challenges, even in the light of these steps taken? One, I would say there is still a very strong focus on all levels on actually talking about a dual nexus and not a triple one. And that was also mirrored whenever we did our interviews and our surveys. And when we asked for definitions what the triple nexus could mean in practice, it very often turned out whoever you spoke to, government representatives, NGOs, UN agencies, most of the time the talk was actually about a humanitarian development nexus, the old dual nexus linking relief and rehabilitation. And that's the same ongoing challenge as indicated in formal terms and programming terms and funding terms, but also in many minds and in organizational cultures as well. Second point, the issue of humanitarian principles has been mentioned, and integrating this, for example, in the German context, even where it was flying and in a fruitful, good way, at the same time came with key challenges on that front. One example has been if you link your humanitarian program and transitional assistance or development assistance, even in the German context, you might be asked to do beneficiary vetting. Practitioners will know why this is a key issue on the humanitarian side. That's something not doable. There is no way to do data sharing on each beneficiary you support, for example, in a war zone with donors. And that's going to be more and more a key ask, apparently, on the development and transitional side. And if you integrate programs, it's very hard to have a firewall that this can't be done in a humanitarian context where you might really risk even the lives of some people if data goes into the wrong hands. Second point, Germany in most crises, maybe even on a different level than some other European actors, apart from France and UK, is a military actor in several key settings and key conflicts. For example, in Afghanistan, in Mali, in South Sudan, it's engaged in UN missions or even in European missions linked with the French. German agencies, for example, when we did our country study in Mali, indicated the key issue that they are seen even as an NGO, an independent NGO, they are become part in the perception by the locals, become considered as a military actor, as taking sides, which of course is a key challenge if you follow humanitarian principles and you want to build on neutrality and to ensure that you are considered as being neutral, so you keep access and you have the option to support everybody. So that has been a key challenge. There starts a mixing up of military roles, of civil society roles, at least in the perception, while of course in some ways it can be a fruitful information sharing and interconnection. Third point, security issues coming into play in key crises have sometimes stressed what humanitarians' concerns is, or even development people, when they say, well, what kind of peace concept are we talking about? A big debate from our view in the HDP debate. What is meant by peace? Is it meant by a peace really integrating inclusive all local actors and building peace on the ground? Or are we talking about security issues, and whose security are we talking about? Is this more about security policy of foreign countries? For example, due to our analysis, the triple nexus could have great potential in South Sudan, where we did a country study, but it can be very challenging in Mali because so many foreign party interests are involved and so much security is dominating with fighting ISIS and fighting migration. So much security and other national interests are coming into play, which might rather have attention to really truly investing on the ground, on the community level into peace and reconciliation with a government which has been part of a coup, etc., as you know so well. Final point, implementation issues have been really a key issue if you really talk about putting it into practice, for example, on the development side, of course, everything is planned in a very long-term way. It's decided upon with counter partner governments in 3 to 5 year ranging programs, coming for good reasons with a lot of ownership, of course, as well for the partner governments. At the same time, the Foreign Office doing humanitarian programs has been moving for other good reasons, for providing more flexible, for providing quality funding, more into, on the one hand, short-term, but very flexible programming funding. So it's really moving away from this project supporting approach. The development ministry is still pretty much following on with INGO partners, UN partners, while the Foreign Office is providing much more flexible funding and giving a bunch of funds to an agency and saying, well, this is flexibly to be used, for example, in 2-3 Sahel countries, but we won't dominate where you invested. And that's good news, but of course then it's very difficult for 2 ministries to coordinate how their funds shall interplay, because at the same time you want to give flexibility to the actors themselves. And final point, budgetary law, I mentioned it already. There is a conflicting goal that from the finance ministry, for budgetary law reasons, there should be never double funding, which is a good idea, of course, because none of us should apply as an NGO, UN agency, or even a think tank for funding from 2 different government sources at the same time. But if you are not allowed to integrate humanitarian and development activities in one program and then ask for funding from 2 sources, how do we then divide again your activities, which would be totally contrary to the whole Nexus idea? So there's also an issue budgetary-wise. To conclude, I believe in the German context, the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus has been a push to move a bit faster on the dual Nexus, on the humanitarian development side, and a series of pilot programs and projects has been coming up over the past years. However, even on the dual Nexus, systematically, structurally, it hasn't been really a major change. And when it comes to the peace element, progress has been really very limited, or even there has been a bias that, on the contrary, whenever the peace element, especially in the key crisis in Afghanistan, in Mali, where a connected approach for a start on the German side has been really an integrated approach, really a failure, then even the peace component has been rather turned to a security component, rather undermining and endangering, especially humanitarian objectives. I leave it with that, and sorry if I've been longer. I missed to look at the watch, and sorry that I can't speak in Spanish. I mentioned before to colleagues that I lost it all when being in Brazil because it was totally mixed. So next time I try to do it in Spanish again. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Ralf, y muchas gracias también por haber puesto sobre la mesa.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for having broached some very tough issues. You've talked about Afghanistan, Mali, Iraq, where peace may well be confused with security issues. Now, in the report that Bea and I prepared, there are 2 nuggets that address the Italian and the German cases. And we now are going to give the floor to Christian Freres from our agency, who represents the agency in many of the CAD sessions focusing on the triple nexus. He is an expert in the field. The recommendations, of course, address Spanish cooperation. So I think you're going to have to say something. Let me begin by saying thank you for your kind cooperation, and we're very happy to have you here. Thank you very much, Paco. Good afternoon to all. I think that we've heard a little bit of background information about Spanish activities and Beatrice's and Paco's comments. So I'm going to see if I can focus on some issues that have not been tackled so specifically. Let me begin by Let me begin by addressing some issues in order to not raise anyone's hopes. Ralf also, I think, was very clear and addressed those limitations, but I'm going to begin to talk about limitations too. We don't have very much information about what actually is happening in Spain. I'm talking here about AECID. Here, I have seen among the participants persons from NGOs, persons from other entities, persons from some of the offices. I hope that they also will be able to participate in order to add information, because I talk only from the agency's vantage point. And perhaps this is a limitation. Perhaps all of us are talking from the humanitarian point of view. That might be a limitation. It's not a bad thing. It isn't. That's whom we speak for. But it is as it is. As Beatriz rightly pointed out, the Nexus is more than humanitarian. So all of the different spheres have to be involved. Another initial thought is that this is the beginning of the process, it seems to me. I thought it was interesting. I don't know whether it's doable, but I like to think. I like to think jointly. What we've seen in Italy, I know a little bit about Italian cooperation. I'm a little bit familiar with their processes. This kind of cooperation has tremendous expertise. I know the process focusing on the diaspora, which seems to me to be very interesting. And for reasons that are not germane to this conversation, we don't have those kind of broad consultations. But there are elements there that I think would be good for us. Above and beyond the results that a consultation of that kind might result in, I think the process itself is important. So it's about getting the stakeholders together, especially some stakeholders who usually are not present in debates of this nature. I'm talking about the more official elements. So Paco talked about the fact that we are about to approve a new piece of legislation on cooperation. It makes references to Nexus. I think we would want to see more, at least in the draft that I have had the occasion of reading, but it is a step forward. I mean, just the inclusion thereof is progress. We're going to definitely have to delve deep in the upcoming session, which is the master plan. That is a document that looks forward 4 years and which is going to be debated in the second half of this year. We are in the midst of a process that calls for reform at the agency. This is a good thing and this is a bad thing when we're thinking about Nexus issues. It's good because at a given point in time when there are reforms underway, it is the right moment to introduce new ideas. But this is a complex reform. It is bidimensional. And I believe it's going to have moments where it's going to leap forward and fall back. It's, one step forward, another step forward, and then a step backward. There's a lot of noise, right? A lot of noise. So it's going to be difficult to include Nexus in this grouping. So above and beyond that legal framework, and without really going into the specifics, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, I think that we need to work at different levels, and there's a project which I think is interesting, where I sit in the agency. How do I attract managers? A process of this kind, we've heard about it in different presentations, calls for far-reaching changes in policies in the organization. And if there are if there's no buy-in, as they say, if people aren't convinced, it's going to be very difficult. I can be completely convinced. I could convince everyone at my level, but if the supervisors, if the principals don't buy into it, well, it's going to be very difficult. So we are successful in having our DG for planning. We were successful and we got her to participate at the INCAF, this CAD dialogue. And the director of the agency, I think, is a person who is convinced. I think that I can rightly say that he understands the importance of this process. But we have to work downstream as well. We've done some micro work. I'm not going to go into the specifics and formulation, inclusion in some of the documents that look at country strategy and skilling activities. And then, let's see, we also have other examples, but these are examples which I believe are not easy to plan for. This is what I like to call the accidental nexus. That's how I like to call them. This has to do with the nexus concept being socialized. It's part of our conversation, and it advances often enough without any clear strategic orientation, which is neither good nor bad. Well, I mean, it's good because you have that available to you, but also I think that we need, who said this? Ralf said this. We need to be systematic in our approach. Let me now, I don't have much time, but let me just make a reference to two examples. One is Venezuela, and I'm referring here to the internal crisis and to the migration in the region. We have created a coordinated entity, which I think is decaf, if you will. It's not everything I'd like it to be, but I think that we have been successful in understanding that development is there. Again, and I think that what Ralf said was absolutely spot on, the peace element. And Paco's talked about this, and Beatriz talked about this in their report, is not really that present. Yes, it's present in the case of Colombia, but Colombia maybe is an exception in the case of Spanish cooperation, because for a long time now, we understand that peace is an essential part of our work. So when everyone started talking about Nexus, it was easy, it was natural to incorporate that approach. I think it was Beatriz who talked about something else. Another line of work that we have in our agency is international fora. She talked about CAF. I wanted to underscore a couple of ideas. She, for instance, has provided a link to a study that was prepared by IECAH, and this is part of something which I believe is promising, but very delicate. I say delicate because it may very well be difficult that it be sustainable. I'm talking about the dialogue between CAF and the United Nations for Nexus purposes. At this point in time, this is year 2 of this dialogue. Tomorrow, we're going to meet. It's going to be an interesting meeting. We're going to talk about the application in 3 different contexts. And there's another line of work, the one that I focus on more. This is the one which talks about trilingualism. So how to make sure that we speak 3 languages at the same time and understand each other at the same time. So 3 languages at the same time, understanding each other. So that is where Nexus Academy arises. I think it's a very interesting project, but I also believe that we need to scale it. I think we have to be very ambitious, and I know that it's going to be very difficult. Let me finish now by sharing some ideas. I'm going to liaise them with the report. This looks at 2024. We are mandated in 2024 to assess the implementation of the CAD recommendation. And this year, what we've done is a kind of an intermediate or interim report. And there are very many ideas. I'm only going to quote 2 or 3 of them because I don't want to take up more of your time. One of them has to do with how to measure success. How to measure success. It's a problem for all of us. But I think that especially for Spanish cooperation, we don't really have a way of seeing this solid culture. So the peace issue, which has been discussed, I think that there we also need, and let me backtrack here, that this is why I thought that the Italian case was very appropriate. You know, I don't know who to talk to at the ministry. I don't know whose door to knock on. There's no office or department which is called peace or peace process. It happens, but it is a function that doesn't have a clear place. It doesn't have a face. There's nowhere you can go. And the Ministry of Defense, of course. It would be interesting, I think, to involve the Ministry of Defense. So, anyways, this is the end of my contribution. I think that we have our work cut out for us. As I said before, we are beginning to advance, and we are extremely grateful to IECAH. Thank you very much for allowing us to share. I certainly look forward to more interesting sessions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Christian. We basically have very little time left, and many of the questions have actually been answered. Thank you, Ralf, because you've been answering. Thank you for that. So I would ask if Ralf, Francesco, Christian, if Bea, if you want to make a comment as to what others have said, spontaneously, if you will, that would be good. And then for the participants, if you want to pose another question, this study is being made available now on our website. So I would ask for an open dialogue. We've talked about Germany and Italy and Spain and the Nexus. Maybe you have final comments. The 4 speakers, I think that would be a golden brooch to this session. Okay, nobody wants to dive in. Oh, Ralf, I see your hand up.
Sorry, I didn't know if I should speak up virtually in my hand or just start.
Much better. Maybe
Maybe just a quick comment. on the experiences on the Italian side and what you shared on the Spanish side, basically, and pretty much also picking up on what Christian said. I believe what is really key is, and I sense we have a common sense here and the consensus in the way that there is potential from our analysis and discussions in Germany and beyond that the humanitarian development peace nexus could be a great vision and an ideal approach, but at the same time, at least our country studies underlined that it's very important, not just in general terms, as we keep saying on every topic and whatever issue we discuss, that it's always to look into local context. And in this case, I think it's even more important because in many contexts, it might lead to the analysis that for the time being, humanitarian development peace nexus will do more harm than good. I shared already the example of Mali, where the triple nexus has been introduced rather from foreign parties and has been framed from the beginning by local partners for the right or the wrong reasons, as being just instrumentalized for security issues, for national interest of engaging parties who should rather leave the country, as the French now do, because they don't feel accepted and respected anymore. Another example, a case study we did, which comes from a different challenge, has been also the politicization of nexus issues by host governments. I think somebody also in the chat asked for, I think, very good reasons. What's the role of national governments? And on the one hand, of course, they are key to support this if they are not party of a given conflict. At the same time, they can be the key obstacle to implement a nexus, which can really fly. We looked into Pakistan, for example, and if you have a setting where colleagues did a case study, if you have a setting where a government even denies and not allows to speak of an internal conflict where a nexus, truly triple nexus approach might help for peace building, for reconciliation. But if you have a government which denies that the conflict is existing and for various reasons tries then to dominate the triple nexus approach in country, again, following this approach by international partners, by a government agency, by an NGO, by a humanitarian actor who needs to insist, as indicated, on impartiality, etc., this might do more harm than good. And so I think it's good we keep discussing and promoting the nexus, but I think in many ways it's really important to also be ready to analyze in this context, this can't fly. While as indicated, for example, in South Sudan, we have had local ownership, we had local actors asking for a more nexus-driven approach, especially, for example, community-based organizations who've been working in an integrated nexus approach for decades until foreign actors came, like us, donors came and said, well, you have to split this up for various reasons, for budgetary law. And now we come with a triple nexus back and say, well, you have to integrate all that because it might fly much better. But I'll leave it with that. And many thanks again already. I won't take the word again, I guess. So many thanks for inviting us, and it has been a very interesting discussion.
Muchas gracias, Francesco.
Sí, me conecto al último punto de Ralf, que creo que es bastante acertado. También cuando hicimos el trabajo en Venezuela vimos eso, que Latinoamérica es uno de esos contextos donde las organizaciones locales hacen programación integrada desde siempre.
National organizations, well, this was the same, and it's us who have exerted this influence. It's us who have divided into different packages. So when we began to interview and so on, well, they couldn't really believe it. We need to do this. So there's that problem there. We have these projects and these programs which really determine the roadmap content. So it would seem that we need to redefine the whole process. I have a critical comment. One of the things that we do in the what we've seen in the different processes, new way of working and so on, we're closer to Libya and to other contexts. And there's been a book of Nexus. We're going to see what the collectives are. We're going to talk about that proclamation, but it's all in a cascade. It's top to bottom without really talking about what that would actually imply. So localization is no longer what it was. The organizations that were in place before have been left behind, and now it's more a Nexus exercises. I don't know. This is my main comment. Be careful to not have Nexus for Nexus exercises. So be a little bit more specific, be more concrete. We know that the mechanisms are in place, and our experience, our best experiences happen when we are no longer focusing on our persons, our organizations, when we really sit down and analyze, and that is when we really work together. That is when we really learn. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Francesco. Christian, I don't know whether you want to react, whether you want to say anything. Well, I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I have to say that thank you very much to the two speakers, because these are ideas that I believe are very important. I'm the focal point of the agency in Nexus, but I don't know whether it's always appropriate or good to think about implementing Nexus. And there are risks that might be implicit. It perhaps a too rigid interpretation. That's what Francesco, I think, was talking about, right? Everything by the book. What we are learning, all of us, what we all learning, is that there is not only one way of applying it. When we think about Nexus Academy, at the beginning, many students actually say, well, how do I go about this? What do I do now? Because they want a Bible. They want a guidebook, a checklist, an instruction document. And that's not how it actually works. It's more complicated than that. And it needs to adapt to every context. And a final thought, the case of Venezuela inside, not the region. This is a regime which does not like to have humanitarian activities, although there is a crisis in the country. It does not want to be the target, and they are holding on to the Nexus concept as if it were an escape route from that definition of the country as a humanitarianly needy country. I believe that in the UN, sometimes there is a giving into this idea without questioning anything. It's not an easy case to discuss. Relationships between the UN and this government specifically are extremely delicate. Of course they are, but here we see that the Nexus issue perhaps might be useful in the dialogue. I do not mean to imply that there is a message that is negative. I do believe that we need to bolster this, we need to reinforce this, but I think we need to understand that this is not going to be an easy path to follow. Bea, I don't know whether you want to add anything. We haven't had much time for questions for your report. No, I just need to say thank you to the speakers. Thank you to all of the persons who have participated. Please reach out if you have questions, if you have doubts. I think that we can, in fact, provide a response afterwards. There are questions, of course, which will encourage us to continue working. This is one of the very important lessons, all of us together. And we need to think about the importance of best practices, the different mechanisms in place, and so on. So thank you very much. And we've come to the end of the session. Thank you, Bea. Thanks to all of the participants. Thanks to the speakers. It has been a very interesting session. As always, we would have wanted to go on for much longer, so we will have to continue to research and work hard. What I think truly matters is to be practical, and as we heard before, we need to be evidence-based. We need to think about the theory, but think about the practical elements. I have enjoyed the session tremendously. I've learned very much, which at my age is a feat. So thank you very much, and I certainly look forward to upcoming IECAH sessions. Thank you to the collaboration of all. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Gracias.
Muchas
Adiós.
gracias.
Muchas gracias.